Hi, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a second. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We are here to talk about a new book, An Open World, by Mira Rapp-Hooper and Rebecca Lissner. And you can purchase a copy of that in our chat. There's a link to Politics and Prose's website, and we really encourage everyone to purchase a copy. It's a great way to support our author and to also support your local independent bookstore. Secondly, the latter portion of tonight's event is going to be devoted to your questions, and we highly encourage you to ask a question. You can do so by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your question there, and you can also see other people's questions. And we're going to try to get to as many of those as we can. We also have a chat for you. You could try to keep that to commentary and keep your questions in the Q&A. It just makes things a little bit easier. And with that out of the way, it is my honor to introduce our authors. We're joined today by Rebecca Lissner, who is an assistant professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and Mira Rapp-Hooper, who is a Stephen A. Schwarzman Senior Fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a Senior Fellow at the Yale Law School China Center. And today they are speaking from their personal capacities about their new book, An Open World, How America Can Win the Contest for 21st Century Order. The book outlines a bold vision for American foreign policy and international order, arguing that only a grand strategy of openness can protect American security and prosperity despite diminished national strength. Our authors tonight will be in conversation with Anne-Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America, and also a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. Without further ado, authors, take it away.
Great. So I am really delighted to be able to be in this conversation with you. And I have to start just by saying it's a terrific book. I'm actually emerita at Princeton. I left the academy in 2013, but when I read this book, I thought I wish I were still teaching a basic IR course because I would absolutely assign it. And it's concise, but it really does balance between a kind of theoretical IR book and a foreign policy grand strategy book. So I'll start with that, but I then my opening question is, why now? I mean, here's this book, it says an open world. That's not exactly the view of the world that the Trump administration has. So why'd you publish this book right now?
Well, I'm happy to jump in and kick us off, Anne-Marie. First, with our thanks to you for joining us in conversation. It really is such an honor to be discussing our ideas with you today. You're truly a giant in the field, and we've really been looking forward to this. Our book, An Open World, is really a call to action. We believe the United States has an opportunity to reimagine its foreign policy for a post-pandemic and potentially post-Trump world. But it needs to seize that opportunity before it's too late. Now, it won't surprise the audience to learn that Rebecca and I began this book in the wake of the 2016 election, but not for the reasons that you might think. We were perplexed when we saw analysts on both sides of the political aisle ascribing to President Trump an unbelievable power. In their telling, he was solely responsible for the diminution of America's role in the world and seemed to be able to destroy the entire international order. That is the set of rules, norms, and laws that govern international politics that have generally prevailed since 1945. As we saw it, however, Trump was much less an architect of all of this destruction than he was an avatar for forces that had been underway for a very long time. And if that was true, the United States would not be able to recoup its pre-2016 position when Trump left office. So we set about to understand the changes that were afoot in the world and in American foreign policy. And while there's no doubt that Trump's presidency has dramatically worsened America's global standing, he's not solely responsible for all of these changes. So if the United States is to rebuild its position after Trump and after COVID, it needs a new approach, one that is both disciplined and globally engaged and sets out to defend an open world.
So Rebecca, one of the things that's so striking about the book is that you take as a given that the US position has truly changed in the world. And you're not tying that, exactly as Mira just said, to Trump, or you're tying that to tectonic shifts. Talk a little bit about how you see that, because I think a lot of people imagine that we're still, the global hegemon, and we've got work to do, but frankly, Obama had work to do after George W. Bush in Iraq, and this will be just the same thing. So talk about how you see the world and the US place in it.
Absolutely. Well, first, let me just echo Mira's thanks to Politics and Prose for having us all today, and especially to Anne-Marie for joining us. It's really an honor to share the virtual stage with you here this evening. So to your question, I think the simple answer is that the rise of China means that the US is no longer the world's unrivaled superpower. But in many ways, American foreign policy and the discussions that we have about it have not adapted to this new position. And China has experienced meteoric economic growth over the past several decades. It's now the largest economy in the world by some measures, and its military power has expanded in parallel. And it's important to recognize that although China itself rose within a US-led international system, it now wants to change the rules of global politics to better advance its own interests and to protect the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian regime. So these realities, regrettable as they may be, have contributed to a fundamentally new era of geopolitics, one that's increasingly come to be referred to as great power competition. And what this means is that the US must now contend with a powerful rival in China that will not only compete with the US militarily in Asia, but will also challenge the US economically, commercially, and technologically around the world. But despite China's rise, the United States remains exceptionally powerful. It has a peerless system of alliances. It still has a predominant dollar that's the global reserve currency. It has an incredible domestic engine of innovation. It has a really mighty military. So the United States still can protect its interests and its values in this more competitive geopolitical environment, so long as it adopts the right strategy.
Can we just do this can we just sort of change if there's a new president in January? Can he change the strategy, or is there a connection between what's happening at home and what's happening abroad? I mean, in many of us, I'll certainly say in my own writing, although I'm a foreign policy person, I've been an internationalist all my life, I tend to look around and think we've really got some work to do right here.
We think that's absolutely right, Anne-Marie. And when we set about to map the forces that were fundamentally transforming America's role in the world, the set of forces that was the most deeply dangerous in our view were those forces contributing to our domestic dysfunction at home. I think we can just look around at this past year and recognize that the United States has appeared to stumble so dramatically, in part because we're in a crisis of competence. The United States is performing far below its capacity. That is to say, we remain incredibly powerful, yet do not appear to be acting in accordance with that power and might on the global stage. And that's in large part due to domestic dysfunction, which owes largely to political polarization. Now, members of the audience will probably be familiar with political polarization in some form. It's the growing gap between the political parties, whether we're talking about our leaders on Capitol Hill, the general public, or even our media environment, as each party grows farther and farther apart with very little overlap between them. But this political polarization has incredibly deleterious effects in foreign policy specifically, and it contributes to a number of factors that makes foreign policy especially unstable. First, it creates incentives for every new government to undo the achievements of its predecessors. We need only look at the Trump administration's drive to undo every major foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration to know that it's true. Second, it diminishes the incentives of political leaders to take a stand on dangerous policies because they know their party won't punish them. So again, another great example is the unwillingness of the Republican Party to stand up against Russian election interference because it has benefited the President of the United States, even though that interference may be worse in 2020 than it was in 2016. What this amounts to is a United States that's increasingly hobbled on the global stage because of this volatility. But if the United States is increasingly consumed with this domestic dysfunction, it will increasingly retreat, just as we have seen in this past year, and cede the field to authoritarian competitors like China, who will increasingly shape a world that is hostile to American interests and values.
So we're going to have to work at home as well as abroad. And I do know you've got a whole chapter on what we've got to do at home. So we've kind of set the stage here. We've talked about how the world has changed with the rise of China. The United States is not in the same position, regardless of administration. What is it going to have to do? So I want to, Rebecca, let me come back to you and let's get to the meat of it. What you set forth a grand strategy, and it's wonderful to see you setting forth a grand strategy of openness. That can mean many things, open can mean participatory, open can mean, be the opposite of closed, open can mean transparent. What do you mean by it?
So in our telling in the book, an openness strategy is a new foreign policy vision. It's a vision that allows the United States to defend its dearest interests and values, even though it's no longer the world's unrivaled superpower. And it really recognizes that the United States can only stay safe, secure, and prosperous in an open world. So what is an open world? What does that mean? Well, that means first that all states should be able to make free and independent political choices without foreign interference in their domestic decision-making processes and without outright domination by stronger, hostile foreign nations. It means, second, that international waterways, airspace, and outer space, a set of areas often referred to as the global commons, must remain open and accessible for commercial and military transit. That means that a country like China should not be able to close off the South China Sea, one of the major international waterways through which global trade flows, to outside commerce or even to military transit. And third, global cooperation and trade should proceed through international institutions that are governed transparently and critically that are modernized for 21st century challenges. And to realize these three pillars of an open world, it's critical to recognize that the US does not need to dominate the world militarily. It just needs to prevent other countries from doing so, while joining very closely with like-minded allies and partners to build a powerful coalition in defense of international openness.
So that is, that is a new strategy. Let's talk for a minute about what it doesn't mean. And so when in 2017, when I wrote a book called The Chessboard and the Web, I talked about a grand strategy of open order building, so similar in some ways, but I actually looked at it in terms of open society, open government, and then open international order. And I based part of that on the criteria for the Open Government Partnership, which is a partnership of about 65 nations committed to transparency, participation, inclusion, and accountability. Mira, let's sort of pull this apart and specify even further what precisely you mean and what you don't mean.
Absolutely, Anne-Marie. And I would just call the audience both to your book and the Foreign Affairs article, because it's a really interesting approach and perspective. And I think a much needed way of thinking about the world, especially in the midst of a pandemic, in many ways very prescient. When it comes to the way that Rebecca and I think about openness, we are primarily focused on openness on the international stage. That is openness in the way that we govern international politics and on openness in the interactions between states. And the reason that we're focused on openness at the international level is because we recognize that there are major challenges to hoping for more open societies around the world in the years to come. That is to say, we wish more societies would be open societies, but we're also prepared to grapple with the reality that China and Russia are likely to be authoritarian until their people choose otherwise. So what we're hoping to bring about is a world that is nonetheless open, despite the fact that these authoritarian competitors, these closed societies, have preferences to the contrary. Now, our vision definitely has a preference for democracy, as I mentioned. We want the United States to lead as a democratic example. We want it to join with allies and partners on the global stage to demand that states adhere to human rights and international law, and to support democracies around the world like Poland or the Philippines that might be backsliding into dangerous territory. But we also recognize that because Moscow and Beijing prefer to keep their societies closed, and because the United States has limited tools with which to intervene in their closure, we're going to have to find a way to govern the world, even though these stronger authoritarian states are very much a part of it. In practice, China is really the only country on the global stage that has both the will and the capability to close off portions of international politics. It's shown its ability to do that in the South China Sea and with its digital surveillance practices, as well as with its human rights policies at home. And while we wish that democracy was in China's near future, we recognize that the United States will ultimately have to leave that to the Chinese people. But in the meantime, we're focused on how the United States can keep itself safe and prosperous, despite the fact that China and Russia may prefer to close off some pieces of international politics, waterways, or technological areas to keep their regimes safer and more secure in their own eyes. So for us, the charge is for the United States to remain an open society itself and support an open international order, despite this increasing push for international closure by the likes of China.
So it's interesting, you're making a case for both standing on our values and supporting them but not militarily, and not imposing democracy or nation building, but standing for them, human rights, support for democratic movements in diplomatic ways, but at the same time engaging non-democracies, autocracies in the ways that we have to do that. Rebecca, what does that mean in terms of our military policies? Because it's striking that you emphasize the panoply of tools that will be necessary to implement a grand strategy of openness. But does this mean we should no longer focus on beating China in a war?
So that's a really important question, Anne-Marie. And the short answer is that the military is going to remain important, but it shouldn't be nearly as central as it has been over the past 3 decades. Because the fact is that, especially since the end of the Cold War, the military has in many ways been the leading instrument of American foreign policy. The United States has used its military to prosecute the war on terror. It has used its military to attempt regime change in countries as diverse as Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. And in many ways, these policies have not met with great success. So even on their own terms, a military-first approach to American foreign policy does not seem to be the most effective one. But also, we've been talking quite a bit about the rise of China and the way in which China really presents a multi-dimensional challenge to the United States and its allies and partners' interests and values overseas. And much of the coming competition with China is not going to be primarily military in nature. Yes.
We hope not.
Right. So yes, we need to remain sufficient military strength to convince China that any attempt to take over Asia by military force will have greater costs than it will have benefits. That's the essence of the idea of deterrence. But we also need to prepare to compete with China in many other different dimensions. We need to prepare to compete with a China that is economically very strong and has a large enough market size that it can use its economic heft to try to coerce or pressure other countries, whether in its region or otherwise, for example, to stop recognizing Taiwan or to censor itself with regards to China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims. We need to contend with a China that is commercially very powerful and is increasingly generating companies like Huawei, which are competing with American and with our allies countries all around the world, and may result in us losing significant market share overseas. We need to compete with a China that has undertaken a massive Belt and Road initiative and that is pioneering an alternative approach to international development. And so for the United States to develop a set of responses that really meet the full spectrum spectrum of challenges that China does present, we can't just rely on our military to do it. We need to build up a really capable State Department, an institution I know that you know well and that you've spent a lot of time thinking about how to improve. We need to get better at development. We need to also figure out ways to really leverage the United States private sector so that our own tech companies are actually on our side and they're working to promote American interests and values when they operate overseas in foreign markets.
Yep.
And Anne-Marie, if I may just jump in with a final thought, part of what we're talking about here in this conversation is the future of the so-called international order, the norms and rules and laws that govern our political interactions overseas. Part of the competition between the United States and China is actually taking place over and through international order. That is to say, what norms will govern human rights? Will they be norms that the United States has long considered universal, that are fundamentally liberal at their core? Or will they have some of the power sapped out of them because the Chinese Communist Party strongly prefers that they do for the sake of its own regime legitimacy?
Right.
Will we govern technology according to open principles as vested in the United Nations and some of its standards bodies? Or will China increasingly build new models for that too? So part of what we're seeing here is not just that the currency of great power politics is no longer exclusively military, it's that it's coming in terms of these international institutions that have long kept the peace, but have now actually become the proving ground for great power relations themselves.
So that anticipates my next question, because part of that struggle now is, are we going to keep the post-1945 system at all? The Trump administration would just as soon have it disappear and is withdrawing from it. If we are, we have to modernize it. We just can't be in 2045 ruled by the victors of World War II as permanent members of the Security Council, where India is not there, but France and Britain are. And that's another subject of contestation between us and China, and actually Russia, interestingly there, where both of them as permanent members of the Security Council may want to talk about modernizing the system, and neither of them are particularly interested in reforming the Security Council. So talk about what you think the US should be doing with regard to the existing institutions as part of, you said, that's part of a pillar of an open order.
Absolutely. This is such an important question. And I'll take the first part of it, which is really focused on what the United States should be doing about existing international institutions. And then I'll kick it over to Rebecca to talk about some under-governed spaces where the United States also has a massive agenda ahead of it. So when it comes to existing international institutions, you're exactly right. So much of this international order that we speak of was created in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War by the victors of that conflict, namely the United States. But those victorious allies are no longer in the same position they were in 1945, and some of them are now, in fact, competitors. So the key organization, the United Nations, absolutely needs to be reformed. And the Security Council, in our view, there's a good case for expanding it to include new voices that are far more representative of the power centers in the 21st century. And that includes some allies of the United States, like Germany. It also includes some close partners that are increasingly aligned, like India. And while Security Council reform has long been an elusive task and may indeed continue to be, we nonetheless think it's really important as a charge the United States should take up. Because only if these allies and partners are on our side and see us as invested in trying to remake these institutions, can we possibly be expected to have their support in other areas as well. Another institution that we would like to see heavily reformed right away is the World Trade Organization, which is essentially ground to a halt, especially since China became a member. It's ill-equipped to deal with issues like intellectual property and intellectual property transfer, ill-equipped to deal with digital services, and certainly not prepared to deal with state-owned enterprises, which is the currency through which so much of China's economic power flows. So by supporting reform at the UN, we hope that allies will join with us to also try to reform the World Trade Organization and other levers of this international order that we absolutely must get moving again if it is to survive to 2045. But I'll kick it over to Rebecca. For
okay, yeah, I'm so thrilled to hear you champion serious UN reform, and the US has never been willing to just come right out and say this has to happen if we're going to keep this order at all. So I'm strongly in your corner there. But so Rebecca, the uninstitutionalized spaces.
Uninstitutionalized spaces are really important because, as Mira was saying, we are living today with a set of international institutions that were built for the world of 1945 and are simply not equal to the challenges, but also the opportunities of 2045. And so we do need to seek to modernize those legacy institutions like the UN Security Council, like the WTO. But we also need to push ahead with new forms of governance. And in some cases, these new forms of governance are going to try to exert pressure on these legacy institutions and the states that inhabit them to try to force the reform that might be difficult to achieve. So if you think about the World Trade Organization, it is a consensus-based body. And so those changes that Mira talked about are vitally important, especially to deal with China's unfair market practices. But China is unlikely to agree anytime soon to, for example, a new code of conduct to govern the state-owned enterprises upon which it relies so heavily. So one form of new governance the US is going to have to pioneer together with like-minded allies and partners is new trade agreements and maybe new trade institutions that set high standards on labor, on the environment, on climate, and really try to exert pressure by changing the incentives that closed states like China do face when they're operating in the international economy and trying to bring that more in line with international openness, particularly if the institutions themselves like the WTO that are universal in membership prove resistant to reform. But in other areas, we need to push into these undergoverned spaces, and technology is a great example of that. There are few meaningful rules today to govern the global internet, to govern cyber, to govern AI and other emerging technologies like biotech. And this is exceptionally problematic. It means that when you're using a foreign-owned app on your phone, like TikTok, there are no protections against what might happen to your personal data. It also means that really scary possible technological applications like killer robots in warfare have no meaningful international norms or guardrails to prevent their deployment. So on these critical technological issues, again, the US can't expect that it's going to immediately write a new set of rules that Russia and China and other authoritarian states might sign on to. But what it can do is pioneer a new set of rules and norms together with its allies in particular that create new incentives, that create new norms, and that establish new deterrence thresholds, thereby changing the calculus of other states and preventing Russia and China's preferred norms from crystallizing. Another area which is just really important, if I may, is in the climate space, where we do have a Paris climate agreement, but it relies very much on domestic level compliance. And there's going to have to be a follow-on regime that is much stronger, more comprehensive, more enforceable. And this is another area where the US absolutely needs to lead in new governance.
Yeah, it's very striking to me that China has a vision of the internet, a sovereign splinter net. The EU has a vision of the internet, heavily regulated, particularly very strong emphasis on privacy. The United States does not have a vision of the internet other than sort of the Wild West, which we could do that when we were making the rules and we weren't facing counter pressure, but now we really do have to have the same vision of what New America's Open Technology Institute calls an open and secure internet, and one that at least is correlative with the human rights regime, so that there are clear digital rights for individuals. We need a vision for that world as much as we need a vision for the physical world. I do think that's hugely important. So we've got about 7 minutes before or 7 to 10 minutes before I turn to audience questions. Mira, I want to come back to you now and let's talk about operationalizing the grand strategy, and let's start with regions. And of course, this is where the United States and China are competing: in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe. China has 16 of the Eastern and Central European countries, but including Greece, are part of the 16+1 summit that China has on a regular basis. And of course, a number of European countries, again, Italy and Greece, are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So talk about how this strategy would apply to different regions.
Absolutely. This strategy basically creates an incentive, exactly as you have implied, Anne-Marie, to think about where the risks of international closure are the greatest and to try to deploy American resources accordingly. So one layer that we've been talking about just now that is not region specific is, of course, the broad global order, right? The international institutions that govern all regions. And the United States has to be heavily invested in their renovation and in their building if any of this is to succeed. But on a region to region basis, there is no question that the hardest case is Asia. And that's because that's the place where China is the most likely to be able to succeed in closing off parts of the physical or the technological world by deploying its own power. So in our
Chinese Monroe Doctrine.
Exactly. In our book, Asia has to become the primary theater of US foreign policy. And that includes in military terms, in economic terms, and in diplomatic terms. The United States has to be heavily committed to keeping the global commons open in Asia, meaning that China should not be able to close off parts of the South China Sea. The United States must remain committed to ensuring that China does not establish political or economic hierarchies over states in its region, preventing them from making independent political decisions. And it also has to be committed to ensuring, as we've been talking about, that the information space stays open, that China isn't able to export its closed system of internet and digital surveillance, thereby creating a splinter-netted world in which ideas cannot be freely exchanged. And there's no question that that's the hardest task in Asia. There are major challenges in Europe too, which is an extremely important theater for this strategy. But although China certainly has designs for Europe, it doesn't necessarily have the same ability to close it off geographically as it would. The United States needs to be focused in particular on China's use of technology and on its use of development finance and norms in Europe. But it also needs to be focused on Russia's use of disinformation and election meddling, which can jeopardize the political independence of allies and partners in Europe, which again would be inimical to openness. But of course, the United States needs to think beyond just Asia and Europe and continue to deploy significant economic and political resources to other regions, including Africa, the Western Hemisphere, and the Middle East. However, there is no question that Asia is the toughest nut to crack in all of this. And while America's foreign policy is going to have to remain global, Asia is the hardest case. And indeed, if the United States can keep Asia open, it has a very good chance of being able to keep other regions around the world open too.
I have to say, I love the idea of simply standing for openness. So I'm going to ask Rebecca one last question and then I will turn it open. I will say, though, that I think many Americans still see you either focus on Asia or on Europe. Europe, of course, is part of Eurasia. When you say, and I agree with you, we must keep Asia open, to me, that is one of the strongest reasons for drawing closer to Europe, because Europe and the United States together have a far better shot at putting pressure on China to basically both militarily, in economic terms, in the commons terms, because our two markets together are really enormous, and because together, Europe in particular has a tremendous amount of attractive power in Southeast Asia, but certainly in Africa as well.
I think that's exactly right, Anne-Marie. If I'll just jump in for 1 minute. A few years ago, this open versus closure distinction may have seemed less salient for our European partners, right? Because things that happen in the South China Sea didn't feel nearly as proximate to them. But as China has continued to rise, and in particular, competition has accelerated in the economic space and in the technological space in particular, as in the standoff over Huawei, the fact that this open versus closure struggle has really come to their doorstep is all too apparent to European partners. And I think you're exactly right that having our European allies on board is essential if we are to keep the rest of the world open.
Absolutely. So Rebecca, last question for me. So let us assume for the moment that Biden wins. And in January, we have a Biden administration. One of the things that his top foreign policy advisors have been writing about, and he himself has said that he would convene a summit of the democracies. He indeed is still talking about the free world. In his foreign affairs article, he said that, the free world is not just the past, it's our future. Some of his advisors have even written about a league of democracies. And indeed, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I wrote with John Eikenberry about a concert of democracies. What would you say, based on a grand strategy of openness, how would you advise a President Biden to proceed?
Thanks, Anne-Marie. This is definitely an extremely salient policy debate, and one, as you pointed out, that you were on the leading edge of a while back. So I think what this comes down to is that if the US is going to renovate the rules, the laws, the institutions that govern international politics and structure the cooperation between countries, it shouldn't be overly picky about its partners. And there's no question that liberal democracies are our natural allies. In many cases, they're also our treaty allies. And a summit of democracies, or whatever other type of concert of democracies might emerge, can absolutely be an important focal point for building a coalition to support international openness. But the fact is that the US cannot do this only with other democracies, and it shouldn't try. We're also going to have to cooperate with illiberal states if we're going to tackle borderless challenges like pandemics and climate change, or even if we're going to push back against attempts by China to close off parts of Asia, whether territorially or technologically. So I think 2 points are particularly important. The first is that our strategy acknowledges the need for the United States to live alongside a powerful authoritarian China, with which, as we've discussed many times already, we will be competing on many issues. But we will also have to find ways to cooperate with China, itself an illiberal state, as mutual interests may dictate, in particular on issues like climate change, where there won't be a meaningful global regime unless the US and China both sign on, but even to protect against future pandemics. And where China is willing to accept open and transparent governance, for example, with BRI, we should be willing to encourage that too. But the second part that's important to understand is that the United States can actually be more successful in leading the forces for openness if it can rally a broad coalition of countries behind its shared ordering vision. And that means that we can bring along liberal as well as illiberal states, understanding that their domestic regime types don't exactly predict their preferences for order in the areas we care most about. So you could think there about Vietnam, itself not at all a democracy, a single party state, but an important partner in keeping the South China Seas open and pushing back against China. Singapore is another example in Asia. And even there are democracies that themselves may not always align with openness. You could think there about India, which in many ways shares the United States' vision of an open security order in Asia that pushes back against Chinese dominance. But India's own internet shutdowns show that in many ways its preferences for technological governance may look more like China's preference for cyber sovereignty, which you mentioned earlier. So we can't draw battle lines around democracies versus non-democracies, liberals versus illiberals. This is really a battle between openness and closure, where the US needs to be entrepreneurial in building a diverse array of coalitions to support our preferred vision of the future of geopolitics.
Yeah, no, it's a great note on which to turn to the audience. Again, what I love about openness is that it is more nuanced and granular than democracy versus non-democracy. And even when we say democracy versus non-democracy, we're really talking about liberal democracy, not just plain democracy. And then, to ask, a lot of what we mean by liberal democracy actually means advanced industrial state. So open is much clearer. Even then, you have to flesh out exactly what it means in different contexts. But I like the fact that we're not asking nations to choose one side or the other, and we are able to distinguish, as you just did, between a Vietnam on the one side and an India on the other. So Stephen Pugh has a question. He says, it seems one huge advantage the US has is our alliances: NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. How damaged are these after George W. Bush and Trump, and can they be repaired?
That's a great question. And thanks so much for tossing it our way. I published my first book earlier this year on this very topic, so I'm delighted to be in conversation on it. Our alliances, exactly as you imply, are deeply damaged after 4 years of Donald Trump. But the damage done to him, as we argue in this book, is not his alone. While Trump has repeatedly denigrated our allies, tried to coerce them into spending more on defense in any number of artificial ways, threatened or actually withdrawn troop commitments from allied countries, our alliances were already being tested before he came into office. And that was because the forces of geopolitics, namely the rise of Russia, the resurgence of Russia, and China's rise, had involved those countries increasingly pushing into non-military areas with their advances. That is, pushing up against America's allies in cyberspace, in the maritime domain, when it comes to the internet, or even on things like development finance and BRI. So America's alliances, which were built to deter and defend against conflict in the Cold War, were already not keeping up with the nature of challenges in the 21st century, because so many of these challenges lie in non-military domains. If we have new leadership in January, it is therefore not going to be enough for the United States simply to try to restore itself to its previous leadership position in NATO or in Asia. Rather, it's going to have to set about to try to move its alliances into all of these new spaces, to combat disinformation and political interference, to strengthen defenses in cyberspace. So the rebuilding effort is much more than simply mending fences and improving our reputation. It's about modernizing the system for 21st century threats.
Great, thank you. And yes, even Obama put some, just definitely put some strain on some of our alliances. And honestly, the American people really are insisting not that we drop out of NATO or anything like that, but that other countries take the lead in different ways, which is not how we've conducted a lot of our alliances. So we have a really tough question from an anonymous attendee saying, Chinese President Xi has made it clear he will not accept the status quo with Taiwan for much longer. Should the US go to war with China to preserve Taiwanese de facto independence? If Xi launches a blockade, missile attack, or outright invasion in the coming decade, how far should the US go to protect democracies from attacks by authoritarian nations? And poor Rebecca, in the alternation between the two of you, this one has landed with her.
That's all right. I'm happy to talk about it, and Mira may want to embroider upon my response. But the fact is, our strategy in putting openness at the center of it and in acknowledging China as the chief international antagonist to openness seeks to create a framework for understanding the types of Chinese behaviors that portend bids to establish closed spheres of influence or dominance or hierarchical hegemony or relationships with other regions. With other states in the Asian region, or even with states beyond Asia. And we try to establish that bright line so that American policymakers can determine when a closed sphere of influence might be in the offing, and where China is taking behaviors or acting in a way that is exemplary of its growing power and influence, but not immediately threatening closure in a way that would be of immediate threat to American interests. And here, I think, there's much to say for the context dependence of what this scenario might look like. But you could certainly imagine a scenario in which a Chinese invasion of Taiwan very much portends a Chinese bid to establish a closed sphere of influence in Asia, which is one that the United States should seek to resist. Now, the best case scenario is, of course, that we forestall that from happening in the first place, which means that the US should remain committed to maintaining favorable power balances in Asia. That will mean modernizing our alliances there so that the balance continues to tip in the favor of the United States, our allies, and of openness. And of course, we also have to continue to encourage Taiwan to take its own self-defense seriously and invest in those types of systems and preparations and resiliency measures that will be necessary to convince China that any attempt to take Taiwan via force will not be successful, and quite simply, the costs will outweigh the benefit.
I'll jump in with a little bit of embroidery on Rebecca's answer too, because it is such an important question, as Anne-Marie rightly noted, such a hard one for US foreign policy. And I will quibble a little bit with the question itself, because while there is no doubt that President Xi has committed to making progress on the Taiwan issue before he leaves office, which could happen in the 2030s for all we now know, he has not necessarily committed to retaking Taiwan by force. And there are good reasons to think that the status quo over Taiwan, while tenuous, could hold for a good while more. First, just to remind our audience, there basically is a frozen civil war that occurred during the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Mainland China claims Taiwan as a part of it. Taiwan has basically had increasingly something on the order of a de facto independence ever since then, and basically identifies as an independent state. And the United States has approached China and Taiwan through a one China policy, meaning that it does not take a position on which China is the legitimate China, only that there is a unified China. However, when it comes to the prospect of reunifying with Taiwan, President Xi only has two options. Number one, he can convince the people of Taiwan to reunify with the mainland by way of some kind of international referendum by which they would agree to restore themselves as part of China. Or number two, he could invade it. Now, pathway number one is less likely than ever, in no small part because of what has just happened over Hong Kong. Hong Kong had a semi-autonomous status within China, which was negotiated when the British handed it back over in the late 1990s. But China has just shown with its new national security law what it means to have semi-autonomous status. That means that it's only a matter of time until Beijing reasserts itself and establishes its top-down control over that province. The people of Taiwan are less convinced than ever that they should sign up for some sort of bargain that looks anything like Hong Kong. But pathway number two isn't particularly attractive either. And that's because China has spent decades investing in a world-class military, and the costs of invading Taiwan and ruling it would be incredibly grievous. Amphibious operations are really difficult to pull off, and the people of Taiwan would not be glad to have Beijing there. So although it's very much the case that President Xi has committed to advancing China's hand, I think it's too soon to convince ourselves that a war with Taiwan is immediately in the offing. Indeed, I think we need to understand that the strategic ambiguity that has governed Taiwan's status since 1979 is actually in many ways one of the greatest achievements of US-China relations in modern times. And actually what we should do is try to create the conditions, as Rebecca laid out, for it to persist for years more so that we don't fight this catastrophic war.
Yep. Right. So I invite the audience to, oh, we've got another question. I'm going to ask one and then I'll come back to it. Rebecca, right now in the pandemic, openness is not exactly the watchword of what needs to happen. Like, we as Americans cannot go to the EU right now because of our COVID status, and that's a perfectly reasonable restriction. You can also think about migration. Right, so we want openness, but we don't want open borders. That is something where you certainly have to have some degree of closure. So how do you think about these transnational issues where, yes, you want an open world, but you don't want a completely open world? How do you fit that within your framework?
So it's a really important question, and in many ways, one of the toughest challenges to this framework is how to contend with these transnational challenges like the pandemic we're living through right now, where, sure, in many ways, the US might be safer if we entirely hid behind our borders and walled ourselves off from any form of interaction with the world. But while I think COVID may seem to suggest that we would be safer if we were less connected, what it really shows is the dire need for a modernized architecture of international cooperation. And for all the reasons that we've discussed already, COVID highlights the critical importance of actually working with other countries to forestall these problems before they reach American shores. Because many of the most imminent threats to Americans, is certainly the most imminent threat to our safety today in the form of COVID, emanates from overseas, but no one country can actually work to solve pandemics on its own. So the United States needs to do is to acknowledge that this kind of international dysfunction and lack of cooperation is both costly and dangerous. And that's when it comes to pandemics, but also when it comes to migration or climate. And that's why an openness strategy is so much about modernizing the architecture of international cooperation. But that being said, the United States does not need to fully embrace openness as a domestic matter in order to achieve an open world. And that's something that we were talking about before. Certainly maintaining open and transparent interactions between states is consistent with some measures of domestic closure, especially in emergencies like the one that we're living through right now. The United States doesn't need to leave itself open to unlimited capital flows or unlimited migration flows in order to defend the open world that we think is so important for our security and prosperity. And the final note I would end on here is just one about the importance of resilience. And by resilience, that doesn't mean self-sufficiency. It means the ability to bounce back and to weather the inevitable disruptions that accompany operating within an open and interconnected world. Because there's really nothing the US can do to minimize the risk of various forms of contagion, whether health or financial, to zero if it is going to continue to lead an open world. But what we can do is make sure that we're able to bounce back from whatever threats do arrive at our shores and to really rebuild, especially from this pandemic, in a way that's going to better equip us to fight back against those threats and to minimize their consequences in the future.
Great, thank you. And actually, Stephen Pugh had asked a similar question about internal and cross-border corruption. I'm going to assume your answer is the same. That's where you really do need to come together with other nations. So we have another question from Beth Baltzon, who says, and this one goes to you, Mira, and it's given your book on alliances. It says, to what degree do our allies see us, the US, as a threat that must be managed? And how does that affect the US ability to implement your vision?
Terrific question from Beth, from whom we have learned so much. Beth is a terrific trade expert, and we turned to her many times over the course of this project. So it's wonderful to see her here, and she's just a brilliant scholar. So there is no question that our allies currently see us as a threat to the international order, and that convincing them that we are no longer that threat is going to be an incredibly difficult task. And there are two parts to the charge as I see it. Number one, we are always going to be the country that elected Donald Trump. We can go on to do a lot of wonderful things in a post-Trump world, and I certainly hope we will, but we will not be able to erase the destruction of the last 4 years, nor will we ever be able to promise that it won't happen again. So what that implies is an approach to institutions like our alliances that seeks to make them more resilient in case something like that ever should happen again. That is, helps to prepare them for the fact that we could become more volatile again and leaves all of our partners better off, even in that world. To my mind, the modernization of our alliance system that I alluded to earlier requires us to increasingly share responsibilities with allies so that a unilateral move in American domestic politics does not affect them all quite as grievously as it did this time around. Now, that does mean that allies should continue to increase their spending on defense, but in my mind, what it really means is that we should expand what we think as our alliance contributions as included, putting more emphasis on the work that our allies do on diplomacy and on development and counting those as part of our alliance structures to build them out as a broader set of cooperation mechanisms. And if we do that, they will be more resilient in the future if we do undergo some kind of leadership catastrophe again. But the second part of this, which is perhaps the most important, is actually the domestic work that we have to do at home to be able to bring any of this foreign policy agenda to be realized. That is, only if the United States invests in itself and in its 21st century competitiveness does it have a prayer at pulling off a strategy of international openness and in renovating its alliances. This means, of course, reinvesting in its innovative capacity. It means spending on education, on infrastructure, including the digital infrastructure of the future. It means investing in our university system and in immigration that keeps us strong and diverse and growing. And if we do all these things, we will be a 21st century great power that is capable of bringing this strategy to bear. But if we fail to make these domestic reforms and try to focus simply on the foreign policy domain and adopting a new strategy and just trying to turn the page, we will never be able to send the signal that we are credibly repairing ourselves and looking towards a new future. So first and foremost in all of this is the work that we have to do at home to really start a new chapter. And then, only then, can we build this open world that we've been talking about here.
And if I could just jump in.
Let me just hang on one second, Rebecca, because we've got 2 minutes and I'm going to come to you. And those were wonderful closing words. So I'm going to ask you to take us home with your reaction to what Mira said and what you want to say in closing. I'll just add that work that we have to do at home also means tackling systemic racism and inequity really far more fundamentally than we ever have. And there too, if we can do it successfully, it will be an important example for many other countries in a world in which many countries have many more migrants. But if we cannot, that is also at the heart of what is troubling our democracy, in addition to authoritarian tendencies. But no Rebecca, you can take us home.
That's such an important point. And I think what this whole part of the conversation underlines is that whatever distinction we might have formerly held dear between domestic and foreign policy has entirely collapsed. So much of what we talk about in the book is a domestic agenda that the US absolutely must undertake to make itself a more perfect democracy, but also to make it more capable and competitive in a 21st century that's going to look very different from the post-Cold War period that we just lived through. And if I could just sort of end on a note of urgency, because I think it's also important to understand what will happen if the US does not seize this small and narrowing window of opportunity that we now have. Because COVID has created tremendous wreckage, both within our country and without, as has the administration of Donald Trump and the accumulation of a lot of these long-term trends that we've been talking about. But the US is still exceptionally powerful along so many dimensions. And we can turn this moment of destruction into a moment of creation. But failure to do so will be grave beyond our wildest dreams. It will see authoritarian nations like China tighten their grips. It will see the global trading system buckle amidst unfair market practices. It will see the global internet splinter into nationalized information systems that don't protect human rights. And this is a world that's going to be increasingly hostile to American interests and values. And in some ways, what is worse, getting back to the question about COVID and closure, is that if the US doesn't lead, it's become abundantly clear over the course of this year that there is no other nation that can. And inaction will mean that the COVID pandemic that we're living through right now may actually be a mild harbinger of much worse disorder to come.
Well, that is a very important, I think, and right way to end. I want to thank Politics in Prose. I want to tell everybody that this is a fabulous book. It's an easy read. It's an incredibly timely read. I certainly hope that if we do have a change of administration, everyone in it has read this book. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne Marie. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you.